The day my father donated my inheritance to charity. He thought he'd won, he thought I'd break. What he didn't know. The charity was mine, and I'd just tricked him into funding his own downfall. Christmas dinner at my father's house was never warm. But this one was different. This one was a funeral for whatever fragile hope I'd still been clinging to. The childish belief that someday he'd see me. Really see me. The table was set like something out of a magazine. All crystal and silver. The kind of perfection that exists to hide rot. My father, Richard Carter, sat at the head, holding court like the king he believed himself to be. My mother, Eleanor, flitted around the edges, refilling wine glasses with the quiet resignation of someone who had long since stopped expecting anything to change. My brother, Jared, held the place of honor at Richard's right hand, smirking into his bourbon like he already knew what was coming. And me? I was in my dress blues, freshly pressed, medals gleaming. I'd flown in from D.C. just for this, not because I wanted to be here, but because I'd spent my entire life trying to prove something to him, to myself, and walking away now would have felt like surrender. The first half of dinner passed in the usual way, veiled jabs about my career, still playing soldier, backhanded compliments about how surprisingly well I'd done for myself, and Jared monopolizing the conversation with stories about his latest business venture, which as far as I could tell consisted of spending our father's money and calling it entrepreneurship. Then came the toast. Richard stood, glass raised, the way he always did, before delivering some pronouncement meant to remind us all who held the power in this family. To Jared, he said, voice smooth as the expensive scotch in his glass, the only one of my children who understands what legacy means. Jared grinned. My mother looked down at her plate, and then Richard turned to me. Which brings me to Sloan. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded set of papers. I've made some changes to my will. The room went still. Hey beautiful soul. Before we dive in, show some love with a like, tap subscribe, and tell me where in this big beautiful world are you watching from. You've made your choices, he said, sliding the documents across the table toward me. And I've made mine. Your inheritance has been donated to charity. Consider it my parting gift to you, since you clearly don't need my money. The words hung in the air, sharp as a knife. I didn't move, didn't react, but inside something cracked. Jared laughed, a loud, ugly sound. Damn, Dad. Richard just smirked and picked up his pen, signing the papers right there at the table like this was nothing more than a business transaction, which to him it was. I looked down at the document. The charity's name was something vague. The Carter Family Foundation, but I knew better. Richard didn't believe in charity. He believed in control. My fingers tightened around the stem of my wine glass. For a second I thought it might shatter in my grip. But then I let go, because that's what they wanted, wasn't it? A reaction, tears, begging, proof that he could still break me. So I gave them nothing. I took the papers, folded them neatly, slid them into my jacket, and then I looked my father dead in the eye and said the only thing I could. Thank you. The table erupted. Jared scoffing, my mother whispering my name like a plea, Richard's smirk faltering for just a second, thrown by the lack of fire. But I was already gone. Not physically. I stayed through dessert. I made polite conversation. I smiled when but inside I was somewhere else entirely. Because in that moment, I realized something. This wasn't a loss. It was a declaration of war. The silence after my father's announcement didn't last. It never did. The Carter family had a way of filling quiet moments with the kind of laughter that felt like a weapon, sharp, calculated, meant to draw blood. Jared was the first to break it, leaning back in his chair with that smug, lazy grin of his. Damn, sis, he said, swirling his drink. Guess you should have gone into finance instead of playing G.I. Jane. A ripple of chuckles moved around the table. My Aunt Margaret, who'd never had an original thought in her life, tittered into her wine. Uncle Robert, who owed my father 3 favors and $500,000, barked out a laugh like Jared had just told the funniest joke he'd ever heard. Even my mother, my quiet, perpetually exhausted mother, let out a soft, nervous exhale, her eyes darting between me and my father like she was waiting to see which one of us would strike first. I didn't give them the satisfaction. Instead, I reached for my wine glass, took a slow sip, and let the moment stretch. Let them sit in it. Let them wonder why I wasn't reacting the way they expected. why I wasn't begging or crying or storming out in some dramatic display they could later mock at cocktail parties. Remember when Sloane lost it over the will? So emotional, so unstable. No, I'd spent a decade in the military learning how to keep my composure under pressure. I'd stood at attention while generals screamed in my face. I'd briefed Pentagon officials who'd looked at me like I was something they'd scraped off their shoe. A few rich assholes laughing at their own jokes wasn't going to break me. But then my father decided to twist the knife. You know, he said, voice smooth as the 30-year-old scotch he was pouring himself, this really is for the best. The military's given you structure, discipline. God knows you needed it. He took a sip, letting the words hang. But let's be honest, you were never going to be part of this family's legacy. Not really. That one stung, not because I believed it, but because it was so calculated. This wasn't just about money. It was about erasure. He was rewriting history right there at the dinner table, and everyone around us was nodding along like it was gospel. Jared, of course, couldn't resist piling on. Yeah, I mean, let's be real. What were you gonna do with the money, Sloane? Buy more combat boots? He smirked, leaning forward. Or were you planning to, what, start your own little army? More laughter, louder this time. I set my wine glass down carefully, the crystal clicking against the table. Actually, I said, voice calm, I was thinking of starting a foundation for veterans with PTSD. My father's eyebrows lifted. Just a fraction, just enough to tell me I'd surprised him. That's admirable, he said in the tone people use when they mean stupid. But let's not pretend you have the resources for something like that. Since when do you care about vets? You're not even deployed anymore. They'd spent so long dismissing me, reducing me to the roles they'd assigned, the tomboy, the soldier, the disappointment that they had no idea what I was actually capable of. Let them think this was the end of the conversation. The first time my father made it clear I wasn't part of his legacy. I was 19 years old and standing in his office with an acceptance letter to Georgetown's ROTC program. Clutched in my hands, I'd spent months preparing my application, studying past midnight, running drills before dawn, pushing myself until my muscles shook with exhaustion, because I knew this was my only shot. Without his financial backing, college wasn't an option, and without college, the military wouldn't take me seriously long term. I can still remember the way the leather creaked as he leaned back in his chair, barely glancing at the letter before sliding it back across his desk like it was a piece of junk mail. You're not serious about this, he'd said. Not as a question but as a decree. I am, I'd said, voice steadier than I felt. This is what I want. He'd laughed then the same way he did at Christmas dinners, like my ambitions were a child's fantasy he was humoring. The military's for kids who can't get into real schools, Sloane. For kids who need structure because they've got nothing else going for them. His eyes flicked over me, dismissive. You're a Carter. Act like it. 2 weeks later he co-signed Jared's loans for Wharton without hesitation. That was the pattern. Every ambition I had, every goal I set, was met with the same amused indifference, like my entire life was just a phase I'd eventually outgrow. When I enlisted after Georgetown rescinded my financial aid, he called it a tantrum. When I made lieutenant he asked when I'd get a real job. When I was recruited by military intelligence he told his friends I was playing spy. But the worst part wasn't his dismissal. It was the way the rest of the family followed his lead. How holidays became a minefield of backhanded compliments. You look so sturdy in that uniform. And condescending questions. Do they actually let women do anything important? How Jared would smirk when our relatives asked about his latest business venture while ignoring my deployments. How my mother would change the subject when anyone asked about my work, like it was something shameful. For years I told myself it didn't matter. That their approval wasn't worth wanting. But that Christmas, watching my father sign away my inheritance like it was nothing, I realized the truth. This wasn't just about money, it was about power. About him proving once and for all that I would never be more than an afterthought in the Carter legacy. And for the first time I wasn't going to let him get away with it. For weeks after that Christmas dinner I told myself I wouldn't dig deeper. That I'd walk away clean, cutting my losses like a soldier retreating from a battle that was never worth fighting. But some wounds fester when left untended, and the injustice of what my father had done burned under my skin like an infection. So when I found myself alone in my DC apartment on a freezing January night, the paperwork from that night spread across my kitchen table. I finally let myself look. The documents were slick with legal jargon, but the bones of it were simple. Richard Carter had donated $2.3 million, my full inheritance, to something called the Carter Family Veterans Foundation. At first glance, it seemed almost noble, the kind of gesture that would earn him a photo op with a senator and a fluff piece in the Wall Street Journal. But noble gestures weren't in my father's vocabulary. Every move he made was calculated, every dollar spent expected to yield returns. So I dug. It took less than an hour to uncover the truth. The Carter Family Veterans Foundation wasn't a charity, it was a shell. A hollow LLC with no board, no staff, no record of donations to actual veterans' causes. Just a P.O. box in Delaware and a single authorized signatory, Jared Carter, my brother, whose latest startup had burned through $1.8 million of our father's money in 8 months. I sat back in my chair, the pieces slotting into place with cold, brutal clarity. This wasn't a donation, it was a laundering scheme. A way for my father to funnel money to Jared while dodging taxes and humiliating me in one stroke. The insult wasn't just that he'd taken my inheritance, it was that he thought I was too stupid to notice. But the real punchline, the foundation's stated mission, supporting veterans struggling with PTSD and reintegration. I nearly laughed out loud at the irony. My father, who'd never served a day in his life, who'd mocked my deployment, who'd called PTSD an excuse for weak men, was now pretending to care about veterans, and he was doing it with my money. That was the moment I stopped seeing this as a family dispute and started seeing it for what it was, a crime. Because here's the thing about tax fraud, it leaves a trail, and I knew exactly how to follow it. The instinct to confront him was overwhelming. I could already picture the scene, storming into his office, slamming the evidence on his desk, watching that smug confidence fracture, as he realized I knew exactly what he'd done. But rage makes you reckless, and recklessness loses wars. I'd learned that lesson in Afghanistan, watching hut-headed officers get their units ambushed, because they couldn't wait for intel, so I did what the military had trained me to do. I retreated, not in surrender, but in preparation. I stopped answering my family's calls, let my father's voicemails pile up. Half-hearted attempts at reconciliation that always circled back to how I needed to apologize for my behavior at Christmas. Ignored Jared's texts, which oscillated between mocking, still sulking, and suspicious. You're being weirdly quiet. Even my mother's tentative emails, filled with vague invitations to lunch, went unanswered. Let them wonder. Let them assume I was licking my wounds. The more they believed they'd broken me, the freer I was to move. At work, I requested a transfer to the Pentagon's Financial Crimes Division. A move that raised eyebrows given my intelligence background, but one I justified with a shrug about broadening my skill set. The truth was, I needed access to databases, to case files, to the quiet, methodical world of forensic accounting, where money left trails sharper than footprints in fresh snow. My colleagues saw a diligent analyst taking on extra training. They didn't see the late nights spent cross-referencing shell company filings with Jared's spending habits, or the burner phone I used to call in favors from old contacts still stationed at Treasury. The key was patience. My father had spent decades building his empire on the assumption that rules didn't apply to men like him, that audits were for small businesses, that laws bent for the wealthy. He wasn't wrong usually, but he'd made one critical miscalculation. He'd underestimated what happened when you pissed off someone who knew how the system really worked. So I waited, I compiled, and most importantly, I let him grow complacent. By the time spring rolled around, the Carter Family Veterans Foundation had quietly transferred $900,000 to a Cayman account, linked to Jared's latest failed venture. My father's accountant had backdated donation receipts. The paper trail was a masterpiece of arrogance, the kind of sloppy fraud that screamed "catch me if you can," and I could, but not yet, because the final piece wasn't in place. See, destroying my father financially would have been easy. Ruining Jared was practically a public service. But I didn't just want revenge, I wanted justice. And for that I needed the one thing they'd never given me: recognition. The devil, as they say, is in the details, and my father's empire was built on a foundation of carefully ignored details. Over the next 3 months, I became a ghost in the machine of his downfall, quietly collecting every overlooked invoice, every carelessly signed document, every digital breadcrumb that could prove what he'd done. The military had taught me how to track insurgents through mountain passes. Following a paper trail through shell companies and offshore accounts was almost laughably simple by comparison. It started with the Foundation's filings. The Carter Family Veterans Foundation existed on paper as a 501(c), but a deep dive into its IRS Form 990s revealed the truth. Zero program expenses, zero grants awarded, just six-figure administrative fees paid to a consulting firm that, surprise, turned out to be another Jared-owned LLC. I pulled every transaction, cross-referenced each wire transfer with Jared's social media posts, the luxury cars, the ski trips to Aspen, the bottle service at clubs where a single night's tab could cover a veteran's year of therapy. The disconnect was staggering, but it wasn't enough. Tax fraud required intent, and for that I needed a smoking gun. That came in the form of an email chain I obtained through a former West Point classmate now working at the SEC. Buried in a subpoenaed batch of messages from Jared's failed tech startup was a thread with my father's accountant, dated 2 weeks before Christmas. Per SEC's instructions read the key line: structure the foundation disbursements to avoid triggering capital gains on the trust liquidation. Attached was a spreadsheet with 2 columns, one labeled donation documentation, the other actual disbursement. The numbers didn't match at all. I printed every page, highlighted every discrepancy. Then I turned my attention to the human element, because juries might not understand offshore banking, but they understood greed. A private investigator paid through an untraceable Bitcoin transfer dug up the receipts for Jared's $250,000 engagement ring, the one he bragged about on Instagram as self-made success. The PI also found the canceled check signed by the foundation, memo line reading Veteran Outreach Program. The final piece came from an unexpected source, my mother. During one of her guilt-driven voicemails, she offhandedly mentioned my father had those foundation people coming for dinner. I drove to their house that night, parked down the street, and watched through the window as my father handed an envelope to a man in a cheap suit. A license plate search identified him as a notary public, one who'd later testify under oath that he'd notarized backdated board meeting minutes for the foundation at that very dinner. By June, I had everything: bank records, emails, sworn statements, even security footage of Jared withdrawing foundation funds from a Vegas casino, all neatly organized in a locked briefcase, copied to encrypted drives stored in 3 different locations. My father's lawyers would later call it an invasion of privacy. The prosecutor would call it the most thorough tax evasion case I've ever seen. But in that moment, sitting in my apartment surrounded by the evidence of my family's betrayal, I called it what it was: justice served cold. For months, I had operated in complete isolation, trusting no one with the truth of what I was building. The risk of exposure was too great. One careless word to the wrong person, and my father's network of influence could smother the investigation before it began. But every soldier knows even the most meticulously planned operation requires reinforcements. And mine came from the last person I expected: General Daniel Haskins, the gruff, silver-haired legend who had mentored me during my first tour in Afghanistan. I hadn't spoken to Haskins in nearly 2 years. Not since he'd retired from active duty to chair the board of the National Veterans Resilience Foundation, NVRF, a nonprofit providing PTSD treatment for combat veterans. But when I discovered my father's shell foundation had stolen its name and logo, filing paperwork as the Carter Family Veterans Foundation, with near-identical branding, I knew I needed someone who could authenticate the fraud. So I took a risk and called him. Haskins listened in silence as I laid out the scheme. His end of the line so quiet I thought we'd been disconnected. Then he said 6 words that changed everything. "I've been waiting for this call." Over the next 3 hours in his Arlington office, the full picture emerged. My father hadn't just stolen from me, he'd preyed on an entire community. The NVRF had spent years building trust with traumatized veterans, only to see donations plummet after the Carter Foundation scandal. Worse, Haskins had received multiple calls from distraught families who'd sent their life savings to what they thought was a legitimate charity, only to discover the money had vanished. "Your father," Haskins said, pouring 2 fingers of bourbon, "is the kind of predator who gives capitalism a bad name." But what he said next stunned me. The NVRF's legal team had already been building a case. They had victims willing to testify. They had evidence of trademark infringement. What they didn't have was access to the financial records I'd compiled. or a plaintiff withstanding to trigger an IRS audit. "You're holding a grenade with the pin pulled, Carter," Haskins said, sliding a folder across his desk. Inside were sworn affidavits from 3 veterans who'd been defrauded. "Question is, you ready to throw it?" That night I made my decision. The NVRF's legal team would file a civil suit for trademark infringement, forcing my father's foundation into the spotlight. Simultaneously, Haskins would use his connections at Treasury to fast-track an audit based on my evidence. But the masterstroke came from an unexpected suggestion. The NVRF would accept my father's fraudulent donation as restitution, legally binding him to fund actual veteran care while exposing his tax fraud. Poetic justice, Haskins called it. I called it perfect. As I left his office, the old general stopped me at the door. "One last thing," he said, handing me a dog tag on a worn chain, his own from Vietnam. "You're not just doing this for you anymore. Remember that when it gets hard." I clasped the tag in my fist, feeling the engraved letters bite into my palm. For the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. The war had just begun. The moment demanded fireworks. A dramatic courtroom showdown, a leaked scandal to the press. Something visceral that would force my father to finally look me in the eye and acknowledge what he'd done. But true power isn't about spectacle, it's about precision. So instead of storming his office or slapping him with a lawsuit, I sent a single email with 2 attachments: the IRS audit request I'd just filed, and a screenshot of the NVRF's press release announcing they'd graciously accepted the Carter Family Foundation's $2.3 million donation to fund PTSD treatment centers. The body of the email contained exactly 12 words. "The veterans thank you for your service. The IRS won't." I didn't wait for a response. I didn't need to. The beauty of the move was its inevitability once the audit was triggered. There was no amount of legal maneuvering or political influence that could stop the process. My father's accountants would scramble, his lawyers would bill him for hundreds of hours, and every financial decision he'd made for the past decade would be dissected under government scrutiny, all while the money he'd stolen sat in accounts he could no longer touch, funding a cause he'd spent his life mocking. The first sign my plan was working came 3 days later when Jared's Instagram, usually a non-stop parade of luxury resorts and designer clothes, went abruptly dark. Then the calls started. First from my mother, her voice trembling with something between panic and accusation. "What did you do?" Then from my father's lawyer, whose attempt at intimidation crumbled when I informed him I was represented by the U.S. Department of the Treasury. But the most telling reaction was the silence from my father himself. No blustering threats, no attempts at manipulation, just radio silence, the clearest admission of guilt I could have hoped for. Haskins called it checkmate in 4 moves. I called it justice, because the truth was, this confrontation wasn't really about the money, or even the fraud. It was about forcing my father to sit alone in the wreckage of his own making, with nothing to distract him from the reality he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. He'd underestimated me, and now his legacy, the one he'd sacrificed his family to protect, would forever be tainted by the very system he'd thought himself above. The IRS audit notice arrived at his office on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, the NVRF had issued a press release, naming me their new Director of Strategic Development, and by Friday, every major financial outlet was running the same headline: "Philanthropist or Fraud? IRS investigates Carter Family Foundation." I didn't attend the press conference, didn't give interviews. Let the paper trail speak for itself. Because the ultimate power move wasn't proving I could fight. It was proving I didn't need to. The system, for once, worked exactly as it should. And my father, he finally learned what happened when you mistook silence for surrender. The collapse of my father's carefully constructed facade happened not with a bang, but in a series of quiet, devastating ripples. The IRS audit was only the beginning. Once the government's spotlight was fixed on the Carter Family Foundation, every financial skeleton came tumbling out of the closet. Within weeks, investigative journalists uncovered a pattern of fraudulent donations spanning nearly a decade, with my father's Shell Foundation serving as a tax shelter for wealthy associates looking to write off sham charitable contributions. The Wall Street Journal ran a front-page exposé, linking Jared's failed business ventures to millions in misappropriated funds. complete with leaked emails showing my father directing his accountant to make the numbers work, no matter what. But the true turning point came when the veterans themselves entered the fray. Haskins had been right. This was never just about me. Dozens of former service members came forward with stories of being duped by the Carter Foundation's fake PTSD programs. Their testimonies a gut punch to my father's carefully cultivated image as a patriotic philanthropist. The most damning moment came during a press conference outside the VA hospital, where a decorated Marine sergeant held up the $50,000 check his unit had raised for the foundation, only for it to bounce. This man stole from warriors who would have given him the shirts off their backs, the sergeant said, his voice shaking with quiet fury. The clip went viral within hours. The institutional response was swift and merciless. The New York Attorney General opened a civil fraud case. The SEC launched an insider trading investigation tied to my father's real estate holdings. Even his golf club, that sacred bastion of elite privilege, quietly suggested he take a leave of absence until the legal matters were resolved. Watching his empire crumble should have felt triumphant. Instead, it felt inevitable, like watching a house of cards collapse under its own weight. The system hadn't failed him. He'd failed to understand that no amount of money could insulate him from the consequences of stealing from those who'd already given everything. By the time the IRS finished its audit, the Carter Family Foundation was dissolved. Jared was facing federal wire fraud charges, and my father had paid $4.7 million in back taxes and penalties, nearly double my original inheritance. The final blow came when the NVRF announced the opening of the Sloan Carter Center for Veteran Recovery, funded entirely by the seized foundation assets. The press release included a single devastating line: "This facility stands as proof that no act of greed can outweigh the power of justice." My father never contacted me about it, but then he didn't need to. The message was clear. The world now knew exactly who he was. And more importantly, they knew exactly who I was. The moment true power shifts rarely announces itself with fanfare. There is no cinematic swell of music, no dramatic courtroom confession. It happens in the quiet spaces: a name struck from a boardroom door, a phone that no longer rings, the subtle way a lifetime of deference evaporates overnight. For my father, that moment came on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday when the IRS formally seized control of his remaining assets, freezing accounts he believed were untouchable. For me, it came later that same afternoon, when I stood in the lobby of the newly christened Sloan Carter Center and watched workers install a plaque bearing my name in polished steel letters. The irony was almost too perfect. Every dollar my father had tried to steal, every cent he'd funneled to Jared under the guise of charity, was now funding a facility that would bear my legacy, not his. The center's legal team had structured the settlement with surgical precision. In exchange for avoiding criminal prosecution, my father was forced to sign over the remaining foundation funds as restitution, along with a personal donation that nearly bankrupted him. The paperwork included a non-disclosure clause barring him from ever publicly disputing the narrative, a twist of the knife I particularly enjoyed. The man who'd spent a lifetime controlling narratives was now legally silenced, his reputation reduced to a Wikipedia footnote about financial fraud. Jared's downfall was equally poetic. Facing federal charges, he'd rolled over on my father in exchange for a plea deal, providing prosecutors with emails that detailed their entire scheme. His testimony made headlines, but the real humiliation came later when his fiancée left him, taking the infamous $250,000 engagement ring with her. I followed the saga through court filings and gossip columns, watching as the brother who'd once mocked my modest military salary sold his sports cars and moved into a studio apartment. He tried calling me exactly once. I let it go to voicemail, where he stammered something about family sticking together before hanging up. I deleted it without responding. But the true measure of my victory wasn't in their suffering, it was in my freedom. With the center's funding secured for a decade, I resigned my Pentagon position and accepted Haskins' offer to become the NVRF's full-time Director of Strategic Development. The role came with something I'd never had before: autonomy. No more begging for budgets, no more justifying my worth to men who'd never see it. Just the work itself, real, tangible change for veterans who'd been failed by the system. The final stroke came at the center's grand opening. As I stood at the podium addressing a crowd of veterans, donors, and much to my amusement, Several reporters who'd covered my father's downfall. I spotted my mother in the back row. She'd come alone, her designer coat looking slightly frayed at the cuffs, her hands clutching a program like a lifeline. When our eyes met, she offered a tentative smile. I nodded back, nothing more. Some bridges couldn't be rebuilt, and I was done trying. After the ceremony, a young Marine corporal approached me, his posture stiff with nervous energy. "Ma'am," he said, I wanted to thank you. This place saved my life." He gestured to the treatment wing behind us where dozens of veterans were already receiving care. "They told me nobody cared about guys like me, but you proved them wrong." I thought of my father then, of how desperately he'd chased legacy, how completely he'd misunderstood what it meant. As the corporal shook my hand, I realized with quiet satisfaction, this was my inheritance. Not money, not property, but something far more enduring. The power to redefine what the Carter name would mean, and I'd only just begun. For years I had carried the weight of my family's name like a curse, something to be endured, overcome, or escaped. The Carters were synonymous with cutthroat ambition and hollow wealth, a dynasty built on transactions rather than trust. But standing in the atrium of the Sloan Carter Center on its one-year anniversary, watching veterans exchange stories and the sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, I realized something profound. Names only hold the meaning we give them, and I had rewritten mine in steel and glass and second chances. The statistics alone should have been enough. Over 1,200 veterans served in our first year with an 82% success rate for PTSD treatment programs. But it was the smaller moments that truly reshaped my understanding of legacy. The Army Ranger who'd wept in my office after reuniting with his daughter, the Marine sniper who'd mailed me a bracelet made from his parachute cord, engraved with the words, "You brought me home," the stack of handwritten letters on my desk, each one a life altered in ways no stock portfolio could measure. This was what endurance looked like, not the cold preservation of wealth, but the living, breathing proof that broken things could heal. My father's lawyers had tried to spin the center's success as redemption for the Carter name, planting puff pieces about his philanthropic evolution. I let them talk. The truth was evident in the way veterans stiffened when his name was mentioned, the way donors specified their contributions should never be acknowledged alongside his. The world had rendered its verdict. Richard Carter would be remembered as a cautionary tale. I, on the other hand, was receiving invitations to testify before Congress about veteran care reform. The irony wasn't lost on me. The daughter he'd dismissed as a glorified soldier was now shaping policy while his empire languished in receivership. Yet the most unexpected transformation was my own. For the first time in my life, I wasn't fighting, not against my family, not against the military's glass ceilings, not even against my own anger. The energy I'd once spent resisting had been channeled into creation. I slept without nightmares. I kept plants alive in my apartment. I even dated briefly a trauma surgeon from the center who laughed when I admitted I'd Googled how to be normal on a date. The past hadn't changed. The betrayals still stung when I let myself remember, but they no longer defined me. Instead, they'd become the foundation for something far stronger, not in spite of what had been taken from me, but because of what I'd built from the wreckage. At the anniversary gala, Haskins handed me a folded flag, the one that had flown over the center on opening day. "For your office," he said. Then with typical gruffness, "Try not to screw up the next decade as badly as you did your 20s. I laughed, but my throat tightened as I ran my fingers over the stars. This was the inheritance I'd earned, not through birthright or scheming, but by outlasting every lie I'd been told about who I was supposed to be. The Carter name was mine now, and I would make it mean something worth remembering. Revenge is a hollow currency. It costs too much to acquire and loses value the moment you spend it. I learned this the day my father's bankruptcy was finalized. Watching from across the courtroom as he signed the papers with a hand that trembled just slightly, there was no triumphant rush, no surge of vindication, just the quiet understanding that his downfall had never been my goal, only a consequence of his own choices. The reporters swarmed as he left the courthouse, shouting questions about the fraud charges and the veterans he'd swindled. I slipped out the side exit, uninterested in witnessing his humiliation. True victory wasn't in his suffering. It was in my freedom to walk away without a backward glance. Jared fared worse, as those without principles often do. Stripped of his trust fund and abandoned by his social circle, He'd taken to posting rambling YouTube videos about government persecution and family betrayal. The comments section was a graveyard of mockery. Part of me pitied him, the golden child reduced to begging for attention in the digital gutter. But pity, like revenge, was a distraction I couldn't afford. When he emailed me a drunken plea for a loan last winter, I marked it as spam and blocked his address. Some bridges aren't meant to be crossed twice. My mother was the only one who still tried to reach me. Her voicemails increasingly strained as the years passed. "Your father isn't well," she'd say, as if his hypertension was somehow my responsibility. "He misses you." The lies were almost impressive in their transparency. I never returned the calls, but I did send her a photo last Veterans Day, a snapshot of the center's mural where dozens of veterans had painted their handprints in the colors of their service branches. She replied with a single line, "It's beautiful." I didn't respond. Some silences speak louder than words. The world expected a dramatic reckoning, a screaming match, a tearful reconciliation, something cinematic to close the loop. But life isn't a screenplay, and closure rarely comes with applause. Mine arrived in ordinary moments. The morning I realized I'd gone a week without thinking of my father. The afternoon a young veteran called me ma'am without it feeling like a concession. The evening I toasted marshmallows with the trauma surgeon on his apartment's tiny balcony and didn't flinch when he called me happy. Haskins put it best during one of our monthly whiskey sessions. "You didn't win because you destroyed them," he said, swirling his glass. "You won because you stopped giving a damn." He was right. The ultimate power move wasn't in the takedown. It was in the walking away, in the unshakable knowledge that I'd built something they could never touch, never taint, never take credit for. The Carter Foundation was ash. The Sloan Carter Center was thriving. And true endings rarely announce themselves with ceremony. They slip in quietly, disguised as ordinary moments, until you look back and realize nothing will ever be the same again. For me, it happened on a random Thursday morning, 8 months after the center's opening, when a padded envelope arrived at my office. Inside was a key, the antique brass one that had once unlocked my father's study, and a note in my mother's looping script. "He wouldn't want you to have this, so I'm giving it to you." I turned the key over in my palm, remembering all the times I'd been barred from that room as a child. How the click of the lock had sounded like a verdict. Not for you, never for you. Now it was just a piece of metal, its power neutralized by time and distance. I nearly tossed it in a drawer, but then I remembered the center's new art therapy wing, where veterans transformed war's debris into something meaningful. So I had the key framed alongside my father's original charitable donation, paperwork, and hung it in the lobby with a simple plaque. "Every lock can be opened. Every story can be rewritten." The symbolism wasn't lost on our visitor. Veterans would pause to study the display, some touching the glass with knowing smiles. One former Green Beret, a man who'd survived 3 tours only to nearly succumb to addiction, told me it was his favorite part of the building. "Reminds me that the shit that cages us," he said, tapping the frame, "usually looks a lot scarier than it actually is." My father never saw the installation. By then he'd retreated to a condo in Florida. His social circle evaporated, his name synonymous with scandal. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd taken up painting insipid seascapes that he sold at flea markets under a pseudonym. The poetic justice would have been delicious if I'd still cared enough to taste it. But that was the gift of true closure. It allowed me to release the weight without needing to watch it hit the ground. The key wasn't a trophy or a taunt, just a quiet acknowledgement that the doors he'd once locked against me were now mine to open or leave shut as I chose. When the trauma surgeon asked why I didn't send the key back or throw it away, I told him the truth. Because this isn't about them anymore. A Marine was using his story to remind others that survival isn't about the battles you fight, but the peace you build after laying down your arms. That was the ending worth having. The world makes a mistake when it assumes closure requires contrition, that justice is only served when the guilty fall to their knees and beg forgiveness. Real life is messier than that. My father never apologized, never acknowledged the harm he'd caused, never admitted that his actions were anything more than business decisions. And yet the universe has its own way of balancing the scales. I saw it in the way strangers treated me now. At conferences, when I introduced myself as Sloan Carter of the Sloan Carter Center, their eyes would flicker with recognition, not of my family's disgrace, but of the work we were doing. I saw it in the hesitant pride of my mother's voice when she told her bridge club, as reported by a talkative aunt, that her daughter ran some kind of veterans charity. Most of all, I saw it in the mirror every morning, in the woman who no longer carried herself like someone braced for battle. The closest my father ever came to an admission of wrongdoing was an email he sent on my birthday last year, a terse 3 lines about how he hoped I was doing well, and that we might put the past behind us. The unspoken demand was clear: absolve me. I deleted it without responding. Some silences are more powerful than words. Oddly enough, it was Jared who provided the most unintentional validation. His failed YouTube channel had devolved into conspiracy rants, and in one particularly unhinged episode, he accused me of orchestrating the downfall of a great man out of jealousy. The comments section exploded with veterans sharing stories about the center's impact. One Gold Star widow wrote, "Your sister saved lives while you were stealing from them. Tell me again who's jealous." I didn't engage, but I did screenshot that comment and set it as my phone's lock screen for a week, not because I needed the reminder, but because it was nice, sometimes, to let the world speak for me. Haskins called this phase the quiet victory. No fanfare, no dramatic confrontations, just the slow, irreversible shift of public opinion. The Carter name might still open doors in certain circles, but now it was mine that carried weight where it mattered: in Senate hearings on veteran health care, in grant review boards, in the quiet gratitude of a soldier's handshake. The therapist I'd started seeing, a perk of working at a mental health center once, asked if I regretted not getting an apology. I told her the truth. The absence of remorse no longer haunted me because I'd built a life where his approval was irrelevant. His silence wasn't a wound anymore, just an empty space I'd filled with better things. Last month, a reporter from the Washington Post profiled the center's work. The article never mentioned my father, not once, and that, more than any forced apology, more than any courtroom verdict, was the true measure of justice. The world had moved on, so had I. The greatest revenge is not destruction, it's reinvention. 5 years ago, I was Sloane Carter, the disinherited daughter, the black sheep in military dress blues. Today, I step onto the stage at the National Veterans Summit as Doc Carter, having just accepted the Presidential Medal for Distinguished Public Service. My work at the center now a blueprint for trauma recovery programs nationwide. The applause is deafening, but what strikes me most is the absence of that old familiar tension in my chest. The one that used to whisper, "You don't belong here." Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped waiting for permission to exist on my own terms. The scars remain, of course. I still flinch at sudden loud noises, a remnant of my deployment days. I still catch myself bracing for dismissal when presenting ideas to powerful men. But these are ghosts, not chains. The woman who once measured her worth by her father's approval is unrecognizable to me now, like a character from someone else's story. My personal life would baffle that younger version of me. The trauma surgeon Ethan and I share a row house in Georgetown with an actual picket fence and 2 rescue dogs. We host barbecues for center staff where no one wears rank or titles, just ridiculous aprons and sunscreen. Last summer, we took his nieces to Disney World, and when a little girl in line recognized me from a news segment about women veterans, whispering, "That's the soldier lady who helps people," Ethan squeezed my hand so hard I yelped. That moment, more than any medal or headline, made me understand what legacy truly means. As for my birth family, they exist on the periphery like faded newspaper clippings. Jared's legal troubles culminated in 6 months of house arrest for tax evasion, after which he moved to Thailand to teach English. My mother sends annual Christmas cards signed only by her. A small rebellion, I suppose. My father lives in a retirement community where, according to a talkative former colleague, he complains about political correctness ruining philanthropy to anyone who'll listen. I used to wonder if he ever visited the center's website, if he saw the impact reports with my name bolded across every page. Now, I don't care enough to wonder. The center is expanding next month, a new wing dedicated to researching moral injury in combat medics. Ethan will lead the clinical team. Haskins, now retired but still ornery, has threatened to haunt the place like a friendly ghost. And me, I've been approached about running for Congress, though I'm leaning towards starting a fellowship program instead. The system changes from within, but it also changes when outliers refuse to play by the old rules. After the medal ceremony, a young Marine corporal stops me outside the venue. Her dress blues mirror mine from a lifetime ago, her posture rigid with nervous energy. "Ma'am," she says, I want to be like you when I get out." I almost laugh at the absurdity before realizing she's serious. So I tell her the truth my younger self needed to hear. "You already are, you just don't know it yet." The drive home takes me past the Lincoln Memorial, its columns glowing amber in the sunset. I think about legacy, not the kind measured in wills or trust funds, but the living, breathing kind that outlasts marble and monument. The kind built not from what we're given, but what we create from the pieces we've salvaged. Ethan meets me at the door with dogs barking at his heels and wine already poured. "How does it feel?" he asks, nodding to the metal around my neck. I almost give the practiced answer about honor and service, but the truth slips out instead. It feels like mourning, and it does. Not because the past is erased, it never will be, but because the future at last is mine to shape. The war is over, the life begins. Strength isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's the quiet decision to walk away, not in defeat, but towards something better. You don't need their apology, their approval, or their name to matter. You just need to build the life they never imagined you could. And when you do, that's not revenge, that's freedom.